The blood had long since faded from the concrete, washed away by 3 decades of Texas rain. But the screams never stopped echoing in the memories of those who survived that summer. August 1991. Austin, Texas. A city that thought it knew evil was about to discover it had been living alongside something far worse than anyone could have imagined. They found her body at dawn. 23-year-old Maria Elena Vasquez lay crumpled behind a dumpster in the alley off 6th Street. Her waitress uniform torn, her eyes still open, staring at a sky that offered no answers. The medical examiner would later note the precision of the wounds, the calculated nature of the attack, the signature that would haunt investigators for the next 32 years. But on that humid August morning, Detective Frank Medina stood over her body and made a promise he wouldn't be able to keep. "I'll find who did this to you," he whispered. "I swear on my badge, on my family, on everything I believe in, I will find him." He couldn't have known then that keeping that promise would consume his entire career, destroy his marriage, and lead him down a path so dark that some nights he wondered if he'd ever find his way back to the light. He couldn't have known that the man responsible was already planning his next attack, already selecting his next victim, already perfecting a technique that would allow him to evade justice for over 3 decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what Austin was like in 1991, what it felt like to live in a city suddenly gripped by terror, to fully appreciate the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Before I continue, I need you to do something for me. This story took me months to research, hundreds of hours to piece together from court documents, police interviews, and conversations with the families who lived this nightmare. If you're watching this, if you're already hooked and want to know what happens, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who loves true crime, someone who needs to hear about the victims who were almost forgotten. These families waited 32 years for justice. The least we can do is make sure their story reaches as many people as possible. Do it now, before you forget, because what I'm about to reveal will consume your attention completely. Austin in 1991 was a different world. The tech boom hadn't yet transformed the city into the sprawling metropolis it would become. The University of Texas dominated the landscape, both physically and culturally. 6th Street was the beating heart of the city's nightlife, a strip of bars, clubs, and music venues that attracted young people from across Texas. It was a place of promise, of possibility, of that particular brand of youthful invincibility that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen to you. Maria Elena Vasquez had moved to Austin 2 years earlier, chasing a dream of becoming a nurse. She worked double shifts at a diner called Rosa's on the corner of 6th and Brazos, saving every penny for nursing school tuition. Her mother, Guadalupe, still lived in the small border town of Eagle Pass, and Maria sent money home every month without fail. She called her mother every Sunday after church, never missing a single week, until she did. When Guadalupe Vasquez didn't hear from her daughter that Sunday, she knew something was wrong. Mothers always know. She called Maria's apartment 17 times before finally reaching the Austin Police Department. By then, Maria's body had already been discovered by a sanitation worker named Jerome Washington, a man who would never fully recover from what he saw that morning. Detective Frank Medina was 43 years old. a 20-year veteran of the Austin Police Department, when he caught the Vasquez case. He had seen his share of violence, the usual collection of domestic disputes turned deadly, drug deals gone wrong, bar fights that ended in tragedy. But there was something different about this one, something in the precision of it, the almost artistic arrangement of the crime scene that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't rage, he told his partner, Detective Sarah Chen, as they surveyed the scene. This was pleasure. Whoever did this took their time. They enjoyed it. Sarah, 15 years younger and relatively new to homicide, tried to maintain professional detachment, but Frank noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she took notes. He didn't blame her. The scene was disturbing in ways that were difficult to articulate, not because of the violence itself, but because of its careful orchestration. This was a killer who had planned every detail, who had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times before acting. The forensic evidence was frustratingly limited. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no DNA, or at least nothing that the technology of 1991 could identify with confidence. The killer had worn gloves, had been careful about hair and fiber transfer, had chosen a location with no security cameras and minimal foot traffic in the early morning hours. He had done his homework, but he had also left something behind, something that wouldn't be fully understood for years. A small mark, almost like a signature, carved into the victim's left shoulder blade. It was so subtle that the medical examiner almost missed it entirely. Just a simple curved line, barely an inch long. At the time, it seemed like an anomaly, perhaps a defense wound or an artifact of the attack itself. It wasn't until the second body that they understood it was intentional. 3 weeks later, another young woman was found dead. Rachel Thornton, 21, a junior at the University of Texas studying journalism. Her body was discovered in a parking garage near campus, positioned with the same careful attention to detail, bearing the same signature mark on her left shoulder blade. And just like that, Austin had a serial killer. The summer of 1991 became known as the Summer of Fear. Young women stopped walking alone at night. Bars and clubs on 6th Street saw their business plummet. Parents called their daughters in panicked tears, begging them to come home, to transfer to schools closer to family, to abandon whatever dreams had brought them to Austin in the first place. The police held press conferences, reassuring the public that they were pursuing every lead, that an arrest was imminent. But behind closed doors, Frank Medina knew they were no closer to catching the killer than they had been the day Maria's body was found. The man they were hunting was smart, patient, and completely invisible. He could be anyone, the businessman in the suit, the construction worker on the corner, the student with the backpack, the neighbor who smiled and waved every morning. That was the truly terrifying part. He wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. He was a man hiding in plain sight, walking among them, possibly even enjoying the fear he had created. The third victim came in September, just as the summer heat was beginning to break. Danielle Foster, 19 years old, a freshman at Austin Community College, who had been in the city for exactly 11 days when she was murdered. Her parents had driven her from their home in Amarillo, helped her move into her off-campus apartment, and hugged her goodbye with all the hope and fear that parents feel when they send their children into the world. 11 days later, they were driving back to Austin to identify her body. By now, the media had given the killer a name. They called him the 6th Street Stalker, even though only the first victim had been found on 6th Street itself. The name stuck because it captured the essence of the fear that had settled over the city. He was everywhere and nowhere, a shadow that could strike without warning, without mercy, without leaving a trace. Frank Medina stopped sleeping. His wife, Elena, would find him at 3 a.m. sitting at the kitchen table, case files spread out before him like tarot cards that refused to reveal their secrets. She brought him coffee, rubbed his shoulders, reminded him that he couldn't catch a killer if he killed himself first. But he couldn't stop. Every hour he rested was another hour the stalker was out there, watching, waiting, selecting his next victim. "You're not God, Frank," Elena told him one night, her voice heavy with exhaustion and worry. "You can't save everyone." "I have to try," he replied, not looking up from the photographs of the crime scenes. Someone has to try. But trying wasn't enough. The leads dried up as quickly as they appeared. Tips flooded in from the public, hundreds of them. Each one investigated with desperate thoroughness, each one leading nowhere. A profile was developed by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, describing an organized killer, probably white, probably between 25 and 40, probably intelligent and socially adept, probably. The word became a curse. What they did know was that the killer had a type. All 3 victims were young women, all brunettes, all attractive, all new to Austin. He was targeting outsiders, women who hadn't yet built social networks, women whose absence might not be immediately noticed. He was hunting the vulnerable. And then, as suddenly as the killings had begun, they stopped. October passed without incident, then November, December. The city held its collective breath, waiting for the next body that never came. Had he stopped? Had he moved on? Had he died or been imprisoned for some unrelated crime? The theories multiplied, but no answers came. By the spring of 1992, the investigation had stalled completely. Other cases demanded attention. Resources were redirected. The 6th Street Stalker, who had terrorized Austin for one brutal summer, faded from the headlines and eventually from public consciousness. But not from Frank Medina's consciousness. Never from his. He kept the case files in his desk drawer, pulling them out whenever he had a spare moment, reviewing the evidence again and again, looking for something he might have missed. He attended conferences on serial killers, studied similar cases from around the country, became one of the department's foremost experts on predatory violence, all in service of a case that everyone else seemed to have forgotten. "Why can't you let it go?" Elena asked him years later, after their marriage had finally crumbled under the weight of his obsession. "Those girls are dead, Frank. Nothing you do will bring them back." "It's not about bringing them back," he said. "It's about making sure he doesn't do it again. It's about making sure their families know that someone still cares, that someone is still fighting for them." What Elena didn't understand, what perhaps no one could understand who hadn't stood over those bodies, looked into those dead eyes, seen the careful cruelty of those wounds, was that Frank wasn't just hunting a killer. He was hunting a piece of himself that had broken loose that first morning behind the dumpster, a piece that could only be recovered by solving this case. The years passed with cruel indifference. Technology advanced. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Cold case units were established in police departments across the country. Frank watched as other cases were solved using techniques that hadn't existed in 1991, and he waited for the day when those techniques might finally give him the answers he needed. He submitted the evidence from the stalker cases for DNA analysis in 2005, hoping for a hit in the rapidly expanding CODIS database. Nothing. He submitted it again in 2010 after new extraction methods had been developed. Still nothing. The killer's DNA was in the system now, a permanent record of his existence. But without a matching sample, it was just a string of letters that spelled out a name no one knew. Frank retired from the Austin Police Department in 2015 at the age of 67. His colleagues threw him a party, gave him a plaque, made speeches about his dedication and service. But all he could think about was the box of files he was taking home with him, the case that would never leave him, the promise he had made to a dead woman 34 years earlier. "I'll find who did this to you. I swear on my badge, on my family, on everything I believe in, I will find him." His badge was gone now. His family had long since stopped speaking to him, but the promise remained, burning inside him like an eternal flame. He continued working the case in retirement, now with the freedom to pursue leads that the department's bureaucracy had prevented. He traveled to other cities where similar crimes had occurred, looking for patterns that might connect to the stalker. He built a database of suspects, hundreds of names, each one carefully investigated and reluctantly eliminated. He corresponded with forensic scientists, keeping abreast of new developments in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. And then, in the spring of 2023, 32 years after Maria Elena Vasquez's body was found in that alley off 6th Street, his phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Amanda Price, a young investigator in the APD's cold case unit, who had inherited the stalker files when she joined the unit 3 years earlier. Like Frank, she had become obsessed with the case. Like Frank, she had refused to give up. "Mr. Medina," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained excitement, "we found him." The breakthrough came not from Austin, but from a suburb of Dallas called Richardson. An unrelated investigation, a sexual assault case from 2019, had led Detective Amanda Price down a rabbit hole that would eventually connect to the 6th Street stalker in ways no one could have predicted. The 2019 case involved a woman named Jennifer Watts, who had been attacked in her apartment by a man she had briefly dated. The attacker, Roger Dale Hamilton, had been identified through DNA evidence and was arrested in early 2020. His DNA was entered into CODIS as a matter of routine, and that's when the system flagged a familial match. Roger Dale Hamilton's DNA wasn't a direct match to the 6th Street stalker, but it was close enough to suggest a biological relationship. A brother, perhaps, or a father, or an uncle. Genetic genealogy, the same technique that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer, was about to crack open a case that had been cold for 3 decades. Amanda Price was relatively new to cold case investigation, but she had done her homework on genetic genealogy. She understood the power of the technique, and she understood its limitations. A familial match was just the beginning. From there, the real detective work started. Roger Dale Hamilton was 46 years old at the time of his arrest, which meant he was only 15 in 1991, too young to be the stalker himself. But his family tree might contain the killer they were looking for. Amanda began building that tree, working backwards through public records, census data, birth certificates, and marriage licenses. Roger's father, Dale Hamilton Sr., had died in 1989, 2 years before the Austin murders. Eliminated. His mother, Patricia, had no brothers. The maternal line was a dead end. But Dale Sr. had two brothers, Robert and Thomas, both of whom had been living in Texas in 1991. Robert Hamilton was 71 years old and living in a nursing home in Fort Worth, suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease. Medical records indicated he had been hospitalized for severe diabetes in August 1991, the month of the first murder. Alibi confirmed, eliminated. That left Thomas Hamilton. Thomas James Hamilton, born March 15, 1954, in Lubbock, Texas. Graduated from Texas Tech University in 1976 with a degree in civil engineering. Married to Sandra Mitchell in 1979. Divorced in 1985. Moved to Austin in 1987 to work for a construction company involved in the city's growing commercial development. He was 37 years old in the summer of 1991. He fit the FBI profile exactly. Amanda's heart was pounding as she dug deeper into Thomas Hamilton's background. Construction work would have given him intimate knowledge of Austin's geography, including the alleys, parking garages, and secluded locations where the bodies were found. His divorce records indicated a bitter separation involving accusations of emotional abuse and controlling behavior. His employment history showed a pattern of moving from job to job, city to city, never staying in one place too long. But none of this was proof. It was circumstantial, suggestive, but nowhere near enough for an arrest. What Amanda needed was Thomas Hamilton's DNA, a sample that could be compared directly to the evidence collected in 1991. This was where the investigation became delicate. They couldn't simply approach Hamilton and ask for a sample. If he was the stalker, alerting him to the investigation could be catastrophic. He might flee, destroy evidence, or even kill again. They needed to obtain his DNA covertly, without his knowledge or consent. Amanda consulted with prosecutors about the legality of various approaches. Trash pulls were generally permissible, obtaining discarded items from a suspect's garbage that might contain DNA. Surveillance was another option, following the suspect and collecting items he touched or discarded in public places. Both methods had been used successfully in other genetic genealogy cases. The problem was Thomas Hamilton's location. Records indicated he had moved from Austin in 1995, just 4 years after the murders. He had lived in Houston for a time, then San Antonio, then a small town in the Hill Country. His current address was listed as a rural property outside Fredericksburg, about 80 miles west of Austin. Amanda assembled a small team of investigators she trusted absolutely. This had to be kept quiet, not just from the potential suspect, but from the media and the public as well. If word got out that they had a lead on the 6th Street stalker, the pressure would be enormous, and the risk of mistakes would multiply. They established surveillance on Thomas Hamilton's property, a modest ranch house on 10 acres of scrubby Texas ranch land. At 69 years old, Hamilton appeared to live a solitary life. He made occasional trips to town for groceries and supplies, attended a local church on Sundays, and spent most of his time working on his property. To his neighbors, he was just another retiree enjoying the quiet life in the Hill Country. But Amanda watched him, and she felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The same sensation that Frank Medina had described feeling at that first crime scene 32 years earlier. There was something behind those ordinary actions, those friendly waves to passing neighbors, those unremarkable trips to the grocery store. Something patient, something calculating, something waiting. On the 7th day of surveillance, they got their break. Hamilton stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of Fredericksburg. He filled his tank, went inside to pay, and purchased a bottle of water. He drank half the water in the parking lot, then tossed the bottle into a public trash can before driving away. 20 minutes later, an investigator retrieved the bottle and placed it in an evidence bag. The cap and the mouth of the bottle would contain Hamilton's saliva, his DNA. The sample was sent to the lab that same day, marked as a priority. Amanda didn't tell anyone outside her immediate team what she expected to find. She didn't want to get anyone's hopes up, including her own. 32 years was a long time. Evidence could degrade, tests could fail. There were 1,000 ways this could fall apart, but it didn't fall apart. 3 days later, the results came back. The DNA from the water bottle was a perfect match to the DNA collected from all 3 victims in 1991: Maria Elena Vasquez, Rachel Thornton, Danielle Foster. Thomas James Hamilton had killed them all. Amanda sat alone in her office for nearly an hour after receiving the results, just staring at the report. She thought about the victims, young women with futures that had been stolen from them. She thought about their families, parents, and siblings who had spent 3 decades wondering if they would ever know the truth. And she thought about Frank Medina, the detective who had refused to give up, who had carried this case with him through decades of disappointment and frustration. It was time to make a phone call. Frank Medina was 75 years old, living alone in a small apartment in South Austin. When he received the news he had waited 32 years to hear, he listened as Amanda Price explained what they had found: the familial DNA match, the genealogical research, the surveillance operation, the water bottle, the lab results. He listened without interrupting, without making a sound, barely breathing. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line. "Mr. Medina?" Amanda said. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," Frank said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here." He didn't cry. Not then. The tears would come later in private, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief, from some place that had been locked away for 3 decades. But in that moment, on that phone call, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. "We're going to arrest him," Amanda continued. "Tomorrow morning, I wanted you to know before it happens. I wanted you to be there if you're willing." There was no hesitation. "I'll be there." The arrest operation was planned with military precision. Hamilton had no criminal record, no known history of violence, no obvious reason to suspect he might be dangerous. But they couldn't take chances. This man had killed at least 3 women with surgical precision and evaded detection for over 3 decades. He was smart, he was careful, and there was no telling how he might react when confronted. A SWAT team was staged nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. But the plan was to approach Hamilton quietly, to catch him outside his home, where he would have fewer options and less cover. They would come with an arrest warrant and a search warrant, signed by a judge who had reviewed the DNA evidence and found it compelling beyond question. Frank Medina arrived at the staging area at 5 in the morning, 2 hours before the planned operation. He hadn't slept at all the night before, but he felt more alert than he had in years. His hands were steady, his mind was clear. After 32 years, he was finally going to look into the eyes of the man who had haunted his dreams. Amanda met him at the command post, a temporary structure set up in a field about a mile from Hamilton's property. She was younger than Frank had expected, mid-30s, with an intensity in her eyes that reminded him of himself at that age. They shook hands, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been communicated through years of shared obsession with this case. "Thank you," Frank finally said, "for not giving up." Amanda shook her head. "You're the one who never gave up. I just picked up where you left off." At 7 o'clock, the operation began. An unmarked vehicle approached Hamilton's property while Frank and Amanda watched through binoculars from a safe distance. Hamilton was already outside, working on a fence near his driveway when the car pulled up. He looked up, curious but not alarmed, as two plainclothes detectives stepped out. Frank could see his face now, distant but unmistakable. Thomas Hamilton looked like any other retiree, weathered by age and sun, dressed in jeans and a work shirt. He looked ordinary. He looked harmless. He looked like 1,000 other old men in 1,000 other small Texas towns. But Frank knew better. He knew what those hands had done, what those eyes had seen, what that ordinary exterior concealed. The detectives approached Hamilton, identified themselves, and informed him that he was under arrest for the murders of Maria Elena Vasquez, Rachel Thornton, and Danielle Foster. Hamilton's reaction was not what anyone expected. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't demand to know what was happening or protest his innocence. He smiled. It was a small smile, barely perceptible, but Frank saw it through the binoculars. A smile of recognition, perhaps, or relief, or something darker that defied easy categorization. Whatever its source, it chilled Frank to the bone. Hamilton was handcuffed without incident and placed in the back of the unmarked vehicle. As the car pulled away, taking him toward Austin and the justice that had waited 32 years, Frank felt something shift inside him. The weight he had been carrying, the burden of that unsolved case, began to lift. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that he could feel the difference. The search of Hamilton's property would continue for the next 3 days. Investigators found a storage shed behind the main house that had been locked with multiple padlocks. Inside, they discovered a collection of items that would eventually be cataloged as evidence. Newspaper clippings from 1991 covering the 6th Street stalker investigation. A journal containing coded entries that appeared to describe the murders in disturbing detail. And most damning of all, personal effects belonging to all 3 victims. Maria's nursing school application, never submitted. Rachel's student ID card. Danielle's class ring from her Amarillo High School. Trophies. He had kept trophies. But the discoveries didn't stop there. The shed also contained items that couldn't be connected to the 1991 cases. Other identification cards, other pieces of jewelry, other personal effects that suggested the 3 Austin victims were not the only women Thomas Hamilton had killed. The investigation was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. The interrogation of Thomas James Hamilton began the day after his arrest, in a cramped interview room at the Austin Police Department. Detective Amanda Price led the questioning, while Frank Medina watched through one-way glass, his eyes never leaving the face of the man he had hunted for 32 years. Hamilton had requested an attorney, as was his right, and one had been provided. But to everyone's surprise, Hamilton seemed eager to talk. Not to confess, not exactly, but to engage, to parry, to play a game he had apparently been waiting decades to play. "You have the wrong man," he said, his voice calm and reasonable. "I don't know anything about these murders." Amanda laid out the evidence methodically. The DNA match, the items found in his storage shed, the journal entries that described the killings in language only the perpetrator could have known. She watched his face as she presented each piece of evidence, looking for cracks in his composure, signs of stress or fear. There were none. Hamilton listened to everything with the patient attention of a man hearing about events that had happened to someone else in some other lifetime. "DNA can be planted," he said. "Evidence can be fabricated. I've read about cases like this, innocent people framed by law enforcement conspiracies." "Your DNA was on all 3 victims," Amanda replied. "Found in intimate contact with their bodies. How do you explain that?" "I can't explain it," Hamilton said. "Because I wasn't there. I didn't know these women. I've never hurt anyone in my life." The interrogation continued for 6 hours that first day and another 8 hours the following day. Hamilton never changed his story, never admitted to anything, never showed a moment of genuine emotion regarding the victims. He was a wall of denial, impenetrable and infuriating. But then, on the 3rd day, something changed. Amanda had been reviewing the journal found in Hamilton's shed, working with a cryptographer to decode the entries. Most of the codes were simple substitution ciphers, easy enough to crack once you understood the pattern. But one section near the back of the journal used a different system, something more complex and personal. It took the cryptographer 2 full days to break it. When she did, Amanda understood why Hamilton had used such elaborate protection for these particular entries. They weren't descriptions of the 3 Austin murders. They were descriptions of 12 other murders, committed in 4 different states over a period of 15 years. Thomas Hamilton wasn't just the 6th Street stalker. He was a serial killer with a body count that dwarfed what anyone had imagined. Armed with this new information, Amanda returned to the interrogation room. She didn't tell Hamilton what they had found, not directly. Instead, she began asking about specific locations, specific dates, specific details that only the killer could have known. Houston, 1988. A young woman named Patricia Morales found strangled in a motel room. Unsolved. San Antonio, 1993. 2 college students, Lisa Chen and Michelle Williams, killed within a week of each other. Unsolved. Dallas, 1997. A waitress named Karen O'Brien, last seen leaving her shift at a downtown restaurant. Her body was never found, but she was presumed dead. Unsolved. As Amanda named each victim, she watched Hamilton's face, and this time she saw something. A flicker in his eyes, a slight tightening of his jaw. Recognition, memory, perhaps even pleasure. "You kept a journal," Amanda said. "You wrote about all of them, not just Maria and Rachel and Danielle. All of them." Hamilton's attorney leaned over to whisper something, but Hamilton waved him off. For the first time since his arrest, he looked genuinely interested in the conversation. "Hypothetically," he said slowly, "if someone had done what you're describing, if someone had been successful for that long without detection, don't you think that would suggest a level of intelligence and planning that deserves some respect?" Amanda felt her stomach turn, but she kept her face neutral. "I think it would suggest a level of evil that deserves only punishment." Hamilton smiled, that small, cold smile again. "Evil is such a subjective term, Detective. One person's evil is another person's efficiency. The interrogation continued for another week. Hamilton never confessed outright, never admitted directly to any of the murders, but he talked around them, discussed hypotheticals, offered theories about how such crimes might be committed without detection. He seemed to enjoy the attention, the opportunity to showcase his intelligence, the chance to finally share secrets he had kept for decades. From behind the glass, Frank Medina watched it all. He had spent 32 years imagining this moment, imagining what he would feel when he finally faced Maria's killer. He had expected rage, he had expected satisfaction, he had expected some kind of closure. What he felt instead was a profound sadness. Not for Hamilton, who deserved every punishment the justice system could deliver, but for the victims, for the families, for all the years that had been lost to this man's cruelty. 15 women, if the journal entries were accurate. 15 lives cut short. 15 families destroyed. 15 sets of hopes and dreams extinguished. And one man, sitting in that interview room, talking about it all as if it were an intellectual exercise, a puzzle he had solved, a game he had won, after watching one particularly disturbing exchange, in which Hamilton discussed the theoretical psychology of a serial killer with the detached interest of an academic. Frank turned away from the glass and walked out of the observation room. He couldn't watch anymore. Some things he realized were too dark to look at directly, even after 32 years. Here's a question I want you to think about. What separates someone like Thomas Hamilton from the rest of us? Is it something biological, hardwired into the brain? Is it environmental, the result of experiences we can never fully understand? Or is it something simpler, a choice made over and over again to value nothing but one's own desires? Let me know in the comments what you think drives a person to become a monster. I read every response, and this is something I genuinely struggle to understand. The weeks following Hamilton's arrest brought a cascade of revelations that kept the story in headlines across the country. Investigators from multiple states converged on Austin, bringing cold case files that stretched back decades, each one hoping to find a connection to the man now known as the Interstate Strangler. The journal, once fully decoded, provided a roadmap of horror that shocked even veteran investigators. Hamilton had been killing since at least 1986, starting with a woman in his hometown of Lubbock, whose death had been ruled a suicide. Over the following 15 years, he had murdered at least 15 women across Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana, always choosing victims who were new to their communities, always evading detection, always moving on before suspicion could attach to him. The question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation was simple. How had he gotten away with it for so long? Part of the answer lay in Hamilton's intelligence and planning. He was meticulous in his preparation, studying his victims for weeks before acting, learning their routines, identifying vulnerabilities, selecting the perfect moment to strike. He used his construction work to gain intimate knowledge of each city he lived in, including the isolated locations where bodies might never be found. But another part of the answer was more troubling. Hamilton had evaded detection not just because of his skill, but because of failures in the systems meant to catch him. Different jurisdictions didn't share information effectively. Serial crime databases were primitive by modern standards. Investigators focused on local suspects and rarely looked for connections to crimes in other states. And there was the victim selection. Hamilton specifically targeted women who were new to their communities, women who might not be immediately missed, women whose disappearances might not generate extensive investigations. He was exploiting not just individual vulnerabilities, but systemic ones. Frank Medina sat in on the multi-agency briefings that reviewed Hamilton's full crime history. He listened as detectives from Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and smaller towns across 4 states shared information about unsolved cases that now appeared to be Hamilton's work. He looked at the faces of these investigators, many of them carrying the same weight he had carried for 3 decades, the same frustration of unsolved cases, the same grief for victims whose killers they had never caught. And for the first time in years, Frank felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own obsession with the 1991 cases. If Hamilton's capture could help solve these other cases, if it could bring closure to these other families, then perhaps something good could come from all this darkness after all. The families of the victims began to gather in Austin as the investigation expanded. Guadalupe Vasquez, now in her 80s, traveled from Eagle Pass for the first time since her daughter's funeral. Rachel Thornton's parents flew in from Minnesota, where they had moved to escape the memories. Danielle Foster's sister, just 16 years old when Danielle was killed, came from Amarillo with her own teenage daughter. Amanda Price organized a meeting for the families, a chance to hear directly from investigators about the evidence against Hamilton and the progress of the case. Frank attended at Amanda's invitation. Though he said nothing, just sat in the back of the room and listened as she walked the families through everything they had found. Afterwards, Guadalupe Vasquez approached him. She was a small woman, bent by age and grief, but her eyes were still sharp. "You are Detective Medina," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry I couldn't find him sooner." Guadalupe took his hands in hers. Her skin was papery and warm. "My Maria told me about you, before she died. She said there was a policeman who came to the diner sometimes, always ordered the same thing, always left a good tip. She said he seemed sad but kind." Frank felt tears prick at his eyes. He had forgotten those visits to Rosa's diner, forgotten the young waitress who always had a smile for him, even at the end of a long shift. "I didn't know that was your daughter," he said. "Not until after." "But you remembered her," Guadalupe said. "For 32 years, you remembered her. You kept your promise." The tears came then, silently, running down Frank's weathered cheeks. He made no move to wipe them away. "I wish I could have done more," he said. "I wish I could have saved her." "You couldn't save her," Guadalupe replied. "Nobody could save her. What happened to my Maria was the work of a very bad man, and there was nothing anyone could have done to stop it. But you didn't forget. You didn't give up. And now, after all these years, there will be justice." She squeezed his hands once more, then turned and walked slowly back to her seat. Frank watched her go. This tiny woman who had carried an unimaginable burden for 3 decades, and he understood something he had never fully grasped before. Justice wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about acknowledgement. It was about saying to the world that these lives mattered, that these deaths were not acceptable, that society would not rest until the truth was known. Thomas Hamilton would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would never hurt anyone again. But more than that, his victims would be remembered. Their stories would be told. their families would know that someone had cared enough to fight for them, even when all hope seemed lost. That was justice. That was what 32 years of struggle had finally achieved. The trial of Thomas James Hamilton began in the spring of 2024, nearly a year after his arrest. Prosecutors had chosen to try him first for the 3 Austin murders, with the possibility of additional trials for the other killings depending on the outcome. The evidence was overwhelming, but the defense team, led by a prominent criminal attorney from Dallas, mounted a vigorous challenge nonetheless. Their strategy was to attack the DNA evidence, arguing that the samples from 1991 had been improperly stored and might have been contaminated. They hired expert witnesses who testified about the limitations of early DNA collection techniques, the possibility of degradation over 3 decades, the theoretical scenarios in which Hamilton's DNA might have ended up on the victims without his being present at the murders. It was a Hail Mary defense, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The prosecution's experts methodically dismantled each objection, explaining the chain of custody for the evidence, the multiple independent tests that had confirmed the match, the astronomical improbability of a coincidental DNA overlap. But the most powerful testimony came from sources the defense couldn't attack: the items found in Hamilton's shed and the contents of his journal. Maria's nursing school application, never submitted, with her handwriting still clear after 32 years. Rachel's student ID card, issued by the University of Texas just weeks before her death. Danielle's class ring, inscribed with her initials and the name of her Amarillo high school. And the journal, page after page, of coded entries describing the murders in clinical detail, detailing not just what Hamilton had done, but how he had felt while doing it. The jury listened in horrified silence as the prosecutor read passages aloud, the words of a killer describing his victims as projects, his murders as completions, his escapes from justice as victories. Thomas Hamilton watched it all with the same calm detachment he had shown since his arrest. He never testified in his own defense, never showed emotion at the descriptions of his crimes, never acknowledged the presence of the victims' families who filled the gallery each day. He sat at the defense table like a man observing events that had nothing to do with him, disconnected, disinterested, empty. Frank Medina attended every day of the trial. He sat in the gallery, usually near the families, watching the proceedings with the patient attention of a man who had waited 32 years for this moment. Sometimes the families looked to him for reassurance, for confirmation that justice was really coming. He gave them what he could: a nod, a slight smile, a presence that said he was still there, still fighting alongside them. Amanda Price testified about the investigation, walking the jury through the genealogical research, the surveillance operation, the DNA match. She was clear, professional, compelling. Frank watched her with pride, this young detective who had picked up the torch he had carried for so long and run with it until the finish line. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning unanimous, guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of capital murder. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of tears and cheers from the families, while Hamilton sat motionless, his expression unchanged. The sentencing phase followed. Under Texas law, capital murder carried a potential death sentence, and prosecutors made clear their intention to seek it. They presented additional evidence about Hamilton's other suspected victims, the 15 other women whose deaths could now be attributed to him, painting a picture of a predator who had spent decades treating human beings as disposable objects for his pleasure. The defense presented mitigation evidence, stories of Hamilton's difficult childhood, expert testimony about possible psychological conditions that might have contributed to his behavior. But even they seemed to know it was hopeless. This was not a case where mercy was possible. This was a case where justice demanded the ultimate penalty. The jury took even less time with the sentence than they had with the verdict: death by lethal injection. Thomas James Hamilton would be executed by the state of Texas. When the verdict was announced, Hamilton finally showed a reaction. That small smile returned to his face, the same smile he had worn when he was first arrested. It was as if he had expected this outcome all along, as if this was simply the final move in a game he had been playing for decades. Frank looked at that smile and understood something he had never fully grasped before. Hamilton wasn't capable of remorse. He wasn't capable of empathy. He wasn't capable of understanding why his crimes were wrong. Whatever switch existed in normal human beings that created conscience and compassion had never been installed in Thomas Hamilton. He was a void in human form, an absence where a person should have been. And he would die for what he had done. Not because death was too good for him, but because society had to draw a line somewhere, had to say that some acts were so beyond the pale that they could only be answered with the ultimate sanction. That night, after the verdict, the families gathered at a small restaurant near the courthouse. Frank was invited to join them, and for the first time in 32 years, he felt like he could sit down and break bread with these people without the weight of failure pressing down on him. Guadalupe Vasquez raised a glass of sparkling cider. "To my Maria," she said, "and to Rachel, and to Danielle, and to all the others we will never know." They raised their glasses together. Frank looked around the table at these faces, marked by decades of grief, but now touched by something like peace. Justice had been done. The man who had stolen their loved ones would pay the price, and perhaps, most importantly, the story was finally complete. 2 years have passed since Thomas Hamilton's conviction. He sits on death row at the Polunsky unit near Livingston, Texas, awaiting the execution that will likely come within the next decade. His appeals have begun, the inevitable legal marathon that accompanies every death sentence, but few observers believe they will succeed. The evidence is too strong. The crimes are too clear. The justice system, for all its imperfections, will see this through to the end. Frank Medina still lives in his small apartment in South Austin, but his life is different now. The obsession that consumed him for 3 decades has been replaced by something gentler, a sense of purpose that extends beyond any single case. He volunteers with victim advocacy groups, speaking to families of murder victims about the long road to justice, offering hope to those who fear their loved ones have been forgotten. He has reconnected with his children, 2 sons who had grown up watching their father disappear into case files and late nights at the station. They don't understand everything that happened. Not fully, but they understand that their father carried something heavy for a very long time and that the weight has finally been lifted. Amanda Price was promoted to lead the Austin Cold Case Unit. She has applied the lessons learned from the Hamilton investigation to other cases, using genealogical DNA techniques to identify suspects in murders that had been cold for decades. Her work has brought closure to families who had given up hope, and it has sent a message to criminals everywhere that time does not guarantee escape. The families of the victims have found their own paths forward. Guadalupe Vasquez died peacefully in her sleep 6 months after the trial at the age of 84. Her obituary mentioned that she was preceded in death by her daughter Maria, but it also noted that she had lived to see Maria's killer brought to justice. She was buried next to her daughter in Eagle Pass, mother and child reunited at last. Rachel Thornton's parents established a scholarship in her name at the University of Texas, supporting journalism students who demonstrate both talent and courage. They say it's what Rachel would have wanted, to help others pursue the truth, even in the face of darkness. Danielle Foster's sister became an advocate for victims' rights, speaking at conferences and lobbying for improved cold case investigation resources. Her daughter, now in college, is studying criminal justice. The family's tragedy has been transformed, not into forgiveness, but into purpose. And the other victims, the 15 women in 4 states whose cases had been cold for so long, their families are finally finding answers too. Law enforcement across the region has reopened investigations, matching evidence to Hamilton's DNA, confirming what the journal entries suggested. Not all the cases will be prosecuted. Some lack sufficient evidence for trial, but the truth is being documented. The stories are being told. The victims are being remembered. I started this story with blood and death, with a young woman lying in an alley and a detective making a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. I told you about the summer of fear, about the years of frustration, about the breakthrough that came 3 decades too late for so many. But I want to end with something different. I want to end with hope. Because the truth is, evil does not always win. Sometimes it takes 32 years. Sometimes it requires advances in technology that no one could have predicted. Sometimes it demands the dedication of people who refuse to give up even when all logic says they should. But justice, real justice, is possible. It is achievable. It is worth fighting for. Frank Medina made a promise to a dead woman in 1991. He said he would find her killer, and he did. Not alone, not quickly, not without cost. But he did it. And in doing so, he proved something that I think we all need to be reminded of from time to time. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Not automatically, not inevitably, but through the efforts of people who care, who persist, who refuse to let the darkness win. Thomas Hamilton thought he had gotten away with murder. For 32 years, he believed himself untouchable, uncatchable above the law. He was wrong. And somewhere in a cemetery in Eagle Pass, Texas, Maria Elena Vasquez rests with her mother by her side, finally at peace. The man who killed her will die for his crimes. Her story will be remembered. And the promise made over her body on that hot August morning has finally been kept. That is justice. That is hope. That is why we never give up. I am grateful to the Vasquez, Thornton, and Foster families for allowing me to tell this story, and to the investigators who spent decades pursuing the truth. If you've made it to the end of this video, please share it so that these victims are never forgotten. Subscribe to this channel because there are more stories like this that need to be told. Stories of cold cases solved, of justice delayed but not denied. of hope in the face of unimaginable darkness. Until next time, remember, every cold case is someone's loved one waiting for answers. And sometimes answers come